So this episode of Garo takes the spotlight of Herman as the main character of this episode. Pretty much this entire episode is the focus of Herman and getting to see what he did in the last week's episode. For instance, last week's episode was focused on Leon and what he was doing when he fought the monster. Well, in this week's episode, we find out what Herman was doing at the exact same time span that Leon was doing in last week's episode. Now, one thing I want to mention before I dive really deeply into this episode, I'm going to talk about some different aspects. For one thing, the beginning of this episode, I understand what they were trying to do. They were pretty much trying to let us know that this episode takes place at the exact same time as last week's episode. That's what they tried to let us know at the beginning of this episode, but I felt it was very lazy on the studio's part for using the exact same animation that we saw last week. I mean, literally, the frame per frame of the beginning of this episode was the exact same animation from last week, and I personally felt that was very lazy, and that was definitely a way to save budget in this episode. That was clearly a way to save budget, especially with the ending scene, also with them actually having the entire rehash scene with, Herman and Leon having their conversation right at the end of the episode. Even though we know the perspective of both characters now for what they went through on both sides of the coin, pretty much, it still was very lazy. At the very least, they could have, changed the perspective a little bit. For instance, they could have shifted the perspective of the characters just a little bit with different camera angles to allow us to see different, scenes. But they decided to actually reuse animation, which is kind of a budget saver. That's exactly what those scenes were for. So, moving past that, now, this episode, it progresses the plot slightly. It pretty much works off of last week's episode with finding out about the knight. For instance, last week's episode, the only real plot we got, honestly, was the introduction of that Black Knight. That's really all we got last week. And with this week's episode, we pretty much find out that the Black Knight actually has a history with Herman. They used to be in a squad or something. They both used to be Makai Knights, and they had this girl with them, which eventually Herman marries, as we know. And we find out about this past of how he, sacrificed himself, and he's go on ahead without me, Herman, and Anna, I think that's her name, go on ahead without me, and pretty much I will hold it off. And then we see him get shot with an arrow, and he dies, which makes me question, how did he survive the entire ordeal of that? How did he become, a fallen Makai Knight? That's the question we have to wonder right there. But that's really all the plot advancement we got in this week's episode. Now, don't get me wrong, the episode was enjoyable, and it was funny. It was a funny episode, and it got my attention for the majority of the episode, especially the entire chasing scene where Herman was pretty much fucking naked, and he jumped over the women's head and grabbed, some of their clothing. I was just that's funny. It was funny. I laughed. But the thing is, this episode could have been 2 minutes long and just focus on that flashback scene it did, and pretty much that's exactly what we would have gotten from this 20-minute episode. Majority of this episode really, at the end of the day, was technically useless. It was filler. Now, don't get me wrong, I like filler, it develops characters, but I don't personally like the way Garo is currently going. I don't like the direction it is taking. Last week, I talked about how, the entire scenes just was not executed properly. It's not the exact same as last week. For instance, these scenes in this episode, I understood them properly, everything was fine, it worked out a lot better. I don't even know what the hell was wrong with last week's episode. Everybody agreed with me. All of you Chibits I saw was commenting you were all confused too, so I was okay, I'm glad I wasn't the only one. But the overall formula that I talked about, I think in episode 3, I remember bringing that up, it was episode 3 or 4, I mentioned that I'm scared that this series is going to start getting into the Monster of the Week type formula, and from this episode and these past couple episodes, it seems like it's starting to do that. It's definitely getting into the Monster of the Week type episodes, where there's barely any plot advancement whatsoever. There's slight plot advancement for 30 seconds to a minute, and it's barely much at all, and then the episode is just mainly filler, taking down the bad guy or dealing with one of these episodic type plots of the episode. That's pretty much what it's been like for the past couple weeks, and it's kind of making me sad, because, I know this series is supposed to be 24 episodes, but I just personally don't like the Monster of the Week type style. I don't. So we'll just have to see. We'll have to see where it goes, but, the episode could have been a lot better, I personally believe. Or at the very least, it could have had a little bit more plot, but nothing is perfect. So tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I love you all so much. You have a wonderful day or not, wherever you live. Please be safe. Chibi out.